Ah, I have access.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dawn Taylor. I'm Communications Director of DAWG, Denver Area Access User Group. And today is the January 2023 presentation by George Young, who is president of DAWG. And his presentation is going to be on using web APIs in Access. So with that, I will let George introduce himself and explain why on earth we want to know this.
Thank you, Dawn, and again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us live online this evening, or if you're watching later on our YouTube channel, thank you for watching. And today we're going to talk about using web APIs in Microsoft Access. Talk about what those are, why they might make sense, and we'll have demos of two types of using web APIs. One is doing a simple GET request for retrieving data from the internet, and a second one is a full CRUD, create, read, update, and delete implementation, all from the Access client. Before we start, I would like to briefly highlight again that this is the Denver Area Access User Group. You can find us on the web at daaug.org. Depending on where in the country you're from, that's either pronounced dog or dog. And you can see here that we have all of our archived presentations. We started recording the presentations in databases in 2003, but we've actually been around since 1994. And you can go back and look at any of the past presentations. So for example, here we had, last year we had Nathan Hellman from Microsoft. And if there are presentation materials, you can download them. And you can also watch a recorded video of each of the presentations. So there's Colin on automatic form resizing, Mike Wolf on troubleshooting query performance. So all that's on our website. I did want to quickly mention, since this is the beginning of the year, DAWG is member supported, and we have a number of regular supporters. Most everyone is from the Denver area. We do have some people from outside of Denver who do support us. This helps to cover hosting costs, email, MailChimp, Meetup, and so forth and so on. If you're so inclined, please feel free to go to the website, go to the About page, and then click on Pay Dues via PayPal. And from there, you can either use PayPal or just a credit card. And the annual membership dues are $30. Also, we have our Meetup website, which of course most of you or all of you online live have seen. And that's here at meetup.com. And you can see we have all of our events announced here. We also have our YouTube channel, which is right here. And here you can see, I think we have about 3 or 4 years of archived videos up there, presentations from Microsoft, a bunch of different MVPs, some members, and so forth and so on. So feel free to check us out at our YouTube channel. And then finally, we're also on LinkedIn. So if you spend any time on LinkedIn, you can just follow DAAUG, Denver Area Microsoft Access User Group on LinkedIn. Enough about that. Let's dig into web APIs in Microsoft Access. So first of all, I'd like to quickly talk about, at a high level, what an API is. They're also called REST APIs or web APIs. REST is sort of a specification for how an API should respond to requests. But in general, at that first bullet point, a web API is just at its core, just a URL. So just like you would have www.dog.org or www.microsoft.com, a web API at its basis level is just a URL. So it uses the internet to have access to data. That is its call protocol. The API exposes endpoints or URLs that provide data access. So the difference between a normal URL or a web page and a web API URL is that a normal URL will just return a web page, whereas a web API URL returns data. And hopefully I have an example here. So here is just a web page. This is on my local development box. And you can see I just have a list of 4 products in an HTML table. So I also have an API built off of this same data that we're going to use. And here is one view of what that API data looks like. Now, this is XML, which for a little while was contending a number of years ago as a format for web APIs. But JSON, JavaScript Object Notation, is pretty much the standard these days. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But here you can see I've got a grid with an ID, a product name, a unit price, and one ice cream $3.99, chocolate syrup, and so forth. And if we go, and I have 4 items here, if we go over to the XML data, you'll see that we have 4 products. So the data that's returned essentially schematically maps to the data that is in the underlying database. So in this case, I've got 1 product, 2 products, 3 products, 4 products. Each has an ID, each has a product's name, each has a unit price. And notice that the outer band is an array of product or an array of type product. If you look at that in SQL, so I'll go ahead and F5 this, and you can see here we have the table with an ID, product name, and a unit price, simple select query on that, and it returns that same data. So whereas for an HTML or normal HTTP web request, I'm going to return some sort of formatted HTML. If I do view source on this, you can see I've got an HTML document header, and here I have an HTML table that's returning header information and then a row for each of the data points. So here we have the ID, the product, and then the price. And again, in the case of the web API, it returns data. It's still just a URL. It's still just something you would put in your browser. In fact, this API is set up so that I can put an ID as a parameter on this. So if I say 2, notice I get the ID of 2. So the querying of a web API takes place via URL parameters, which can either be part of the URL itself, in this case /2, or they can be query string parameters, ID equals X, temperature equals Y, and so forth. And that's at the core, that is how an API works. There are 2 types of API data access, and this is where it gets very similar to the database access. So one type of data access, and the most common one, is to fetch or get or select data, to read data. So that would be a select from. Another type of data is posting or adding data, and that's write. And that's where you would have update or insert or delete. So the most common type of web API data access is get, or reading data. And in that case, you send a URL request with optional parameters and you receive back a response with data. Just give me 1 second, I'm sorry. I'm going to pause for 10 seconds. I'm back. Sorry, I had a crying 14-month-old in the background. Okay, so the most common type of web API access is the GET or the read. And that's what we did in our example here. We just sent a URL and we got the data back. And that's what we're going to start off with, is looking at the GET. And that's the most common thing on the internet, because essentially there are gazillions of web APIs that cover all sorts of different types of use cases. For example, Google has a bunch of map-related APIs. You can provide it a street address and it will return latitude and longitude coordinates. You can provide a start point and an end point, and it will give you detailed routes, directions. There's APIs out there for currency conversion, for time zone conversion, for weather, for example. But there's an access to a whole bunch of different types of data out on the internet that you can use to augment your application, which traditionally just uses the information that you have within your database. So again, we already took a look at this, but I did want to show you the JSON format as well. So on the left, there's the HTML. In the middle, there's the SQL. And on the right, there's the JSON format, which we'll be working with. It's very similar to XML in that it's sort of structured. Each curly brace there, open and close, is a unit or a record. So you can trace right along ID of 1, product name ice cream, unit price $3.99. And that maps to this row in the database. Similarly, then we have a parenthesis and our next product, an ID of 2, product name of chocolate syrup, and a unit price of $2.49. The only data types in this, since it's essentially JavaScript at its core, are strings and numbers. Now within that, there are different types of numbers, but you can see you either wrap your value in double quotes to indicate that it's a string, or you just have it standing out there alone, indicating that it's some sort of number. But that's essentially how this JSON, this web API data maps to SQL and indeed to Access databases in general. Are there any questions before we move on? Great. Okay, so why REST APIs? So what features or advantages do web APIs offer? Well, from the consumption perspective, let's say that you're just calling APIs, you get access to data from across the internet. A lot of it is free. Some of it requires that you register and get a token that allows you to use it as a developer. And some of it is paid. For example, a lot of them will have, a lot of web APIs will say, okay, for 500 uses in a given time frame, it's free, or 5,000. And then beyond that, it's 2/5 of a cent per access or something. A second thing, in addition to the plethora of different types of interesting data available to you, is that it's a single standard data access model. So it's one way of talking to all the data that's out there. And we'll talk about what that data access model looks like. But you saw a bit of it where we had the URL that brought us back all of the products. Oops. And then to get just a single one, we just added an ID on the end. So that data access, that's universal. That's part of, if you will, the REST specification. So you don't have to learn a bunch of different types of query language. You don't have to install a bunch of different libraries to access different data sources. It's one single common data access model. And then also there are libraries for all sorts of platforms, meaning for application platforms. So there's one for VBA, which is what we're going to use today, that you can use from Access, but you can also say use from Excel. There are libraries for Java, for .NET, for JavaScript, for Windows 32 applications, for UWPs, for WinUI. So there's a very, very nice set of rich libraries to make consuming APIs easier. If you're providing an API, let's say for your organization, and you want to provide a certain amount of CRUD access to some of the data from an API, it's more secure in the sense that the database credentials only live behind the API. So you don't have to expose your database credentials. You will have to expose a token or email and password authentication. But the access to the database itself, those credentials are hidden behind the API and never exposed to the end user. Again, once you expose that those data access points, any number of different types of clients can access it. So you don't have to support specific platform types of access to your data. You just expose this web API and any type of client can access it. And that also has the advantage that there's only one data access layer that you have to manage, which is the web API interface. So how do you call a web API? We saw the URL where we just had a URL in the browser and it gave us some data, but there's more to that. So you have requests and you have the response, just like for a web page. And the request consists, again, primarily of that URL, a base URL. You then have a route added onto the URL, which goes to the specific API. And then you have some query string parameters if needed. So far, we haven't done that. The second thing you have in the request are headers. So that's additional information, just like you have in your browser. When your browser requests a web page from a server, it sends HTTP headers. The same thing happens with a web API call. And finally, there's a body, optional body, which is needed for if you're going to pass in data. So for example, if you're adding a new record, you need to send in the data for those fields that you're adding. Or if you're editing an existing record, again, you need to provide those fields. So URL consisting of a base, a route, and parameters, and then headers, and then a body. The request goes off, and what comes back is a web API response. And that consists of essentially two things: a status code, which tells you that it succeeded or not, and if not, what type of failure. And then the data content comes back. So on the right of the screen, you can see that I have a VBA function, and you can hopefully see in there that it sort of maps more or less to the sections on the left. So here we create a web client and we set a base URL on it. So that's essentially the server or the host name. Then we create a web request and we give it that resource or that path, and we say it's API, products API in this case. We then tell it the method that we're going to use. Is it a get, a put, a post, delete? In this case, it's a get. And then we say another header, the format that we want, which is JSON. We then dimension up a web response, and the web response is what is returned from web client execute, passing in the request. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So we have a base URL, we have a route to the API endpoint, we specify a method and a format that we want returned, and then we execute it. And the response that comes back is where our data is. Here I have a quick check of the status code. And notice I say web response.status code is not equal to OK. Then I want to show the status error and bail, if not continue. And then here's where I access the data, web response.data. And we'll have much more about this, but I wanted to at least give you an idea from a high level of how the VBA code using the library maps to what is happening in the web API request and response itself. So any questions on that so far?
Yes, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Do you know if there are any limitations on the size of the web response that is generated? Like the length or number of records or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have not looked at that. I wouldn't believe so. But I could be wrong. There are limitations on like query string size, and that sort of thing. But in terms of the response that's coming back, I don't think so, but I could be wrong. I've never encountered one.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So now we get down to where the rubber meets the road. How do we do this in Access? So the first thing we need to do is to use a VBA helper library. There are a few out there. We recommend using VBA Web. There's a presentation that was done by Juan Jose Luna, where he went over a few different types of libraries. And this one that is really nice. It abstracts out some of the details, some of the nasty string concatenation that you might have to do in other libraries. It also supports authentication, which we're not going to do today. This is kind of an intro, but it does support authentication. It supports file uploads and downloads. So VBA Web, which we'll take more a look at in a little bit. You also need to add necessary references in the VBA environment. So you can see over on the right there, in addition to VBA and the Access and the OLE automation, I also have the WinHTTP services and the Microsoft scripting runtime. So those are two things that you will need to make use of the VBA Web library, and those are installed on your system. So use a library, which we'll talk more about, add the references in your VBA environment, and then finally, there's a tool called Postman, which we'll take a look at. Which allows you to kind of play around with your calls and make sure that you have your parameters and your headers and body if needed before you actually do it in VBA. So how do you set up VBA Web? You go to the site, you download the zip file, and then you put the following 5 helper classes into your VBA modules. And now I'm going to go over to Access and also to the website and show you what that looks like. So here is a sample Access application that I can make available afterwards if people want. I have one local table here. You can see I have cities, 4 cities with a latitude and longitude. And then I have this city weather form. And as you can see, I pick a city here. And then once I pick a city, I click Get Weather. And it goes off and fetches the weather for that city. So what's it like in Denver now? Nice and warm in Alice Springs. Denver, we're at 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's well below 0 Celsius. In Ipanema, it's a balmy 70, and in Manchester, I'm sure it's like 10 degrees and raining. Yeah, 0 and raining. Okay, so this is a web API. This uses just a get to go off and get weather data. So again, you can imagine that you have your application and you want to provide local weather or a little map or currency conversion or so forth and so on. So Karen asked, will this lecture be available to view later? Yeah, so Karen, we have a channel on YouTube, and it will be posted there by Monday up there. And that's just youtube.com/DAAUG. And that'll get you there for that. Okay, so that's what that looks like. So if we go off and look at the code behind this, so hopefully the introduction has been a little bit useful for that. So first of all, you can see here that I have web helpers, authenticator, client, request, and response. So those are the things that I needed to add. So how did I add those? Again, you go to the URL, VBA Web, you click code, download the zip file. You open it up. And you just unzip it, extract all. And you just grab these guys. Okay. And you basically just show you how it works. I mean, I'm not going to do it, but you basically just drag and drop them over here. You see the plus sign. It's that easy. And it puts them in your VBA environment for this project. Well, that's that. Now on VBA Web, they also have documentation. There's a wiki. So you can sit in and with examples, how to implement authentication, for example. They also have samples down at the bottom of the page with some basic stuff. So, and they do have documentation as well. So that's how you get the library added. So now let's take a look at this weather API. So here's the URL that we're using. So I say new web client set the base URL. So that's the first thing, right? Base URL. Then we have to create a web request. We set a resource, that's the path. So the URL is api.openmeetup.com v1/forecast. We tell it we're going to do a get. We're just getting data. And we want the format to be JSON. And then what we do is we add a bunch of query strings because this service needs the latitude and longitude of what your of the city or location that you're requesting, then whether you want to show the current weather, then whether you want it in Fahrenheit or Celsius, then whether you want it the wind speed in miles per hour, and then your time zone. So this is the abstraction that that VBA Web offers. And notice that it's very comfortable for somebody who's used to using VBA and not doing a lot of string parsing. I'll show you what the alternative looks like. So here is a different API called VBA JSON. And notice that we're basically concatenating all this stuff in here. So latitude equals, current weather equals, temperature unit equals, da 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 da. So that's essentially what we're building, but we do it in kind of a well-parameterized way here. Okay, so we declare a response, and we set the response equal to the return value of the execute method on the web client, passing in the web request. So all this web request stuff that we have here, which has a resource, a method, a JSON format, and a bunch of query string parameters, all that gets piled into this and gets returned. We get a status code back, and then we set up our dictionary object for the data. So let me clear the immediate window here and just show you quickly what this might look like. So here I have get weather data from VBA Web. And I see I'm just debug printing out some stuff, and then I'm calling the get weather from the API. And in the API, you can see I debug print out a bunch of data. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a second, but let me just show you what the JSON data kind of looks like when it comes back. So I'll just F5 on this. And so you can see that I'm getting the URL. And so you can see the URL got formed based on those query string parameters I had. The status is 200, which is okay. Here's what the data looks like that came back, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. That's all the data there in that JSON format. And then I have the parsed out, or if you will, the name value pair information for that data. What's the time that it was done? 7 p.m. on the 19th, and the Denver time zone. What's the temperature? 23 degrees Fahrenheit, the wind speed in miles per hour. So the last piece that I'm going to look at on this is how we access the data once we get it back in the web response. And that's where another area where the VBA JSON is very nice, because it turns your data into a dictionary object. So any questions so far at this point? Questions on the library, questions on a web API, questions on any of the terminology that we have? No, great. Okay, so let's go back to the Access application here. So hopefully you have an idea now of what happens. Now, if you're interested in what the Access code looks like, let's take a quick look at that. So that is here in the form city weather. So I'm just going to take a quick look at this. I'll make this available for download, but essentially get button weather click. So I check to see if there's a value. If there's not, select a city. I zero out the three text boxes. I set the label to getting weather, call to events, and then I go into my database and I say, and this again is my cities database. And I select latitude and longitude from that table where the ID is equal to the value that's in my list. And then I go off and I call my API passing in city latitude and city longitude. And then I set the values of the three text boxes and change the status to done. So if we go back and look at this again, I'm going to Denver. So I click it. I'm going to null these out. I'm going to pass the Denver from my table, latitude and longitude, off to the web API. It's going to come back with the dictionary object, and I'm going to set those values in there. So that access is essentially this dictionary that you drill down. So current weather temperature, current weather wind speed, current weather wind direction. I'm going to quickly show what that looks like in text. So you can see what comes back as latitude, longitude, a bunch of other stuff, and then there's just current weather node. So this is because this has a set of nested brackets in it, it's kind of almost like a child table, if you will. So it's like current weather ID, and then it goes off to a current weather table and gets these values. But again, JSON, just like XML, allows you to nest them in line. So if we had more than one location, we'd have a nested current weather for each one. But you can see I access result, which is the top level, and then current weather, which is this. And then let me move this over just a bit, sorry. Temperature, which is this. So result, current weather, temperature. Wind speed, result, top level, current weather, wind speed, right there. Wind direction, result, current weather, wind direction. So that's how you access, kind of like a set of nested dictionaries that get you the value associated with each name in the name value pair. All right, any questions on that?
Hi, George, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
If I have another nested level inside current weather, then it
So
will add another parentheses after the results, right?
right.
Okay.
Right. So you could have something like I don't know, preset, and then like that, and then you'd again have another block, and then it would say, let's say type, equals snow, and then a comma, and then measurement equals inches, and then I don't know, amount is 2.5. So yeah, you have within current weather, you would have another nested object. So this is just a scalar value, name value. And here we have name, and the value is actually an object. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and I want to get that value by putting in another parentheses after the results, right?
Right, yes. So you would come here and you would say current weather dot preset, and then that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Great. Okay, great. Any other questions on that? Okay, so we talked about this in VBA. We have VBA Web, 3 objects. Web request builds a request. So that's where you give it essentially the base URL. And sorry, the web client gets a base URL. The web request where we add all the headers and the parameters. The web client executes the call, and then the web response is returned from web client execute. It's pretty straightforward. We build up a web request, we give it to the web client to execute it, and a web response comes back to us. It's relatively simple. And then the return data is available using web response.data. And it's accessed, as we saw, using a dictionary. So you dimension a variable as dictionary, and then you set it to the response data. And notice here, I can also set it to children of that. So I set the root to response data. I declare weather as a dictionary. And then I say set weather equals root current weather. And now I can access this as weather time, root time zone. If we go back to our example, so root has a time zone, and that's what I've specified up here, and weather has a time. So I can access them using essentially these direct pointers into that level of the hierarchy. I could have set, set preset equal weather, or weather open paren, preset close paren, and then I could have said, preset type, preset measurement, preset amount. And that's how the dictionary object works. Okay, so now we have, we've done the simple VBA web using this existing table that I used to look up and get weather information. So now we have a more advanced one, and this is full on CRUD. And let me show you what that looks like in the browser, first of all. So APIs, public APIs, are always documented on a web page. So here on my little website that I built, here's my HTML, and I have API, and I'll click on that. And notice that here I have a list of all of the APIs that are available to me. And notice I have 2 gets, get all products, get product by ID. I have a put, I have a post, and I have a delete. And I have a document, and I should have got this into the slide deck, and I apologize if I didn't, but let me just book this up so you can see this. So this is a mapping of CRUD to what it looks like in SQL to what it looks like in an API. So when you create something, that's an insert, a new record. In the web API world, you do a post method. To read, it's a select from in SQL, and it's the get method. We've looked at that, and that allows us to read 1 or more records. To update something, update an existing record, SQL, it's update. The method in API is put, and then the delete is delete, which is the same thing across the board. So if I go ahead and put this next to our API here, whoops, and there we go. Let me bring my Word doc back. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure what's going on here. Okay, so here's our get. So that's just a read or select. Then we have a put. That's where we update an existing record. We have a post. That's where we create a new record right here. And then we have delete, where we delete an existing record. So what is going on here with this form is that I am going to get a bunch of products from my API from the same database. So I have this running locally. So here's the database that I'm using. Notice that I'm not referencing it at all within Access. This is going to be done purely via web API. And let's go ahead and get our products. And you can see we have ice cream, chocolate syrup, sprinkles, and banana. Just to show you that this is actually live data, we go ahead and edit this. And bananas are on sale now for 39 cents. And I'm going to go back and call get products again. And you can see now we have it at 39. So I'm doing a get in my web API, going off to the web API, which talks to the database, and getting a list of products. Now I can edit, I can create a new product, and I can delete one. So let's select a product. Let's select ice cream. And let's go ahead and make a change to it. So let's just say that it's vanilla. Vanilla ice cream. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. Notice that vanilla ice cream now shows up here. And if I go back to my database and hit F5, now we have vanilla ice cream. So that's doing the put method where I'm editing an existing product. So let's go ahead and add a new one. So we got vanilla ice cream, chocolate syrup, sprinkles, and banana. Does anybody have a recommendation for some sort of topping or ingredient that's missing?
Fudge,
Fudge?
hot fudge.
Hot fudge.
Hot fudge. Okay, and that's the very deluxe, so it's $10.99 a bottle. I'm gonna go ahead and save this, and now hot fudge shows up here. If we go back to the database, hot fudge is there. Again, we can select it, and we can say cold fudge, and over here F5, cold fudge, and we can decide we didn't want it, and we can delete it. And I need to select it. There it is. Now it shows up down here. Now delete, and it's gone. And if we come over here, it's gone. So essentially, within this form, and I'm not an Access UI forms designer expert, but hopefully you can kind of see all the different interactions that we have going on. We're getting, we're putting, we're posting, and we're deleting. And when we click on one of these, we get it by ID. That's how that goes. So let's, any questions on what's going on here before we look at the code behind the scenes? No.
Josh,
go
I
ahead.
have a question.
Yes, sir.
So I thought you were talking about web API. So the data in SQL is that on the web so that you can access that data using a web API?
Yes, exactly. So
Okay.
the data, in this case, I'm storing the data in SQL Server, and thank you for the clarification request. So I'm storing the data in SQL Server, but in Access, I'm not talking to SQL Server. I'm talking to a web API, which is here on my local machine at localhost 4430. So here's the documentation that gives me for get products API, right? So that's in the JSON and the XML. So that's how I'm talking to the database indirectly. Did that answer your question?
Yes. May I see the URL to that
Yeah.
actress in Access though?
Yes. So we'll get to that in just a second. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I just
Thank
wanted to
you.
make sure conceptually. So your question was exactly the kind of sort of conceptual clarification before we looked at the code. So thank you for that. Any other questions? All righty, let's look at the good stuff here. So I'm going to go ahead and alt F11, and this is in form products. So we have form products where I interact with my form, and then we have my products API as a module. So let's first take a look at form products. What happens here? So get products click, that's when I click on this guy here. And he just calls get products. What's get products? It's this. Dim products as an object, get product list from API. So that's where we're gonna go take a look at that URL. And then first I'm gonna remove all the existing products from my list. And then I'm going to, for each item in my list, I'm going to add it to that list box. So getting the ID, getting the product name, and getting the unit price. And I'm doing a for loop, a for next loop, passing an integer from I up until the count. So I go to product 1, product 2, product 3, product 4, until I've done it, and then I'm out of there. Okay. So let's take a look at what that code looks like. So let's go look at get products list from API and our products API. So here's what it is. Now, remember, we got 3 things. We have a web client, we have a web request, and we have a web response. So web client, here's my base URL, localhost 330. It's on my dev machine. That's my base URL. I then set up my web request with the resource, the path, which is API products API, my method, HTTP GET, the format I want for return, which is JSON. And then lastly, I dimension up my web response, and then I execute the client, which returns it to me. I then have a status code check to make sure nothing failed. I do my helper function for debugging the output. I set my root as an object and I return the data. And then I set my function return value to that root. So the URL here is this, it's a local host. Yeah, Ben.
So your request is going to an address called HTTP GET. Is that the name of the method that returns this data?
Yes. So the address. Thank you. Let me clarify this. So the URL, Ben, is going to be the base URL plus the web request.resource. So that's going to be HTTPS localhost 44340 / API product API. Okay.
Okay, I read that wrong. Okay, so it's called products API is the
Yeah.
name. I see.
Yeah. So if I actually take this now and I go into my browser here, and I'm just going to put a new thing, paste it in. There it is. You see that? That's just raw data coming back. If I add a 1, it's going to return just that. So the URL is the base URL and the resource. And then the method tells me, is it a get? Is it a put? Is it a post? Is it a delete? Right? What type of CRUD thing am I doing? And then the format is what I want the return value to be in, which is JSON.
And the default must be GET and must be JSON because that's what we see in the browser.
I believe so. Although the default, yeah. So in this case, so this, and I'm going to show you this web API that I built in Visual Studio. It returns XML by default. So in the old .NET framework, it returned XML by default. In the new one, the .NET Core, it returns JSON by default. But I'll show you how to change that. So in this case, we're saying, hey, whatever it is that you want to give me, I only want JSON.
And one more question.
Yes, sir.
What's the object type? How do we know what the object model is, or is it a collection or what?
Yes, excellent. Very good point. So is it a dictionary or is it something else? In this case, it's something else. Why? Because it's a list, it's an array of dictionaries. So the last thing I have to talk about, and Ben, I couldn't have asked for a better segue, thank you, is something called Postman. So you go to www.postman.com, and it's a free utility that allows you to basically test any web API anywhere in the world. All you do is you copy the URL and you put it in here. So I'm going to go over here, right up here. I'm going to copy this guy in here. I'm going to click send. And there it's brought it back. So this tells me what the API looks like, right? Now, I go over here in my documentation, which again, all web APIs that are out there publicly have this. And notice that I have get API, products API ID. Let me come back over in here and put an ID and click send. And there it is. Now I have one that says put API products ID, post API products ID, and delete API products ID. Now in these cases, in the case of put and post, I have to include body, which is the one thing we haven't looked at yet, because I have to actually give it data. But in the case of delete, I just pass in API products and I change the method to delete. And then I click send and it will execute a delete on that. So the Postman allows you to explore the URLs, including creating body elements and authorization, which again, we're not talking about today, but it's a whole nother area that is supported by VBA Web, and they have documentation on it. And if there's interest in that level of detail, maybe we do another presentation in the future. But does that make sense? So let's take a look at, we'll take a quick look at so that was getting the list. Now we have get product where we pass in the integer. So this is exactly the same code, except that I now have a product ID that I'm passing and I add as a query string param ID product ID. So notice that when I put in the ID here, it returns this. That's essentially what I'm doing in my VBA Web. I'm basically just saying add a query string parameter to the ID. So now my URL looks like this. Okay. So that's getting added on. So, but yes, go ahead.
Can you send in multiple parameters there? I mean, you said like ID 1, ID 2, ID 3. Can you do it that way? Or would that be a different?
Yeah, I think the API would have to expose it that way. So if the API exposes multiple query string parameters of the same value and is able to parse those, then you could do it. Absolutely. Or you could have, say, max equals 1 and min equals, 0, or, max equals 10. I don't know, but this would be something that the API itself would have to expose. But that's a great question, because if you're creating a web API, you can expose any functionality you want via the query string. So let's say I want to search for products. So I can have a search and I could say, search equals, and they type in, some sort of string into a text box, and I pass that, into my API, and then where my API is a search, I then do a search in my database in SQL and return the matching list. Does that kind of make sense, George?
Yeah.
Okay. But again, the same thing. Base URL, web request, path, get, I'm still doing a get, and I want JSON back. The web response is just the web client execute, and then that. I didn't answer Ben's question fully. When we notice here, we have a single guy, we have a single object. But if I get the list back, I should have array. Whoa. Oh, I see. Oh, I deleted something. See, you gotta be careful in Postman. I still have the delete method. So notice I have the array bracket here, Ben. So that tells me that actually what I have is an array, and I'm going to have to go through that array and then access each of the objects. And the way that I know that is either by doing it in Postman and checking out what the return value looks like, or in the documentation for the API, which in this case, you can see here, I have that array bracket. So that tells me I have a collection of these guys. Whereas if I look at the single one, notice that it's just the single object entity. So that's why I declared an object over here for the list rather than a dictionary. I hope that answered the question. Okay.
But you're using the object, the root in the next one too, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah, and I could have just set it as dictionary also, but I think probably in the form, let me see, command get product. List product split. So here I cast it as a dictionary. So it comes back as an object and I cast it as a dictionary when it comes back.
So a dictionary is a not a native data type in Access. So you have to install the.
Yeah, so thank you. So the dictionary it's a VBA thing that comes with
Scripting runtime, I think.
Yeah, it's scripting runtime. Yes. Yeah.
So
And
just to
it's-
clarify for everyone that this dictionary object is that is returned by JSON is compatible with the VBA dictionary object.
Yeah,
You would
exactly.
normally assume that, you know.
Well, the library, the VBA web library, basically creates it as a Microsoft scripting library dictionary. That's how they decided to map it.
Okay.
Yeah. Great question. Any other questions?
Yeah, George, how do you make to become the response in XML and in JSON both? Right.
So, yeah, great question. So the question is on your web API. Well, when in doubt, go to Postman. So let's see, params. Let me go back over to my VBA, and what do they call it here? It's called web format. So I don't even know if that's what it's called, but let's see. This might not be this one. Let's see. Okay, didn't like that. But there's, I would have to look up and figure out what to pass in. But you can as the client, you can say, well, let's go here. This is going to break my application, but I think it will. So XML. All right. So let's go ahead and try and retrieve something in XML and see if it breaks anything. So we're dealing with the products guy, and we're still getting it via JSON, but now when we click, it's going to get via XML. And it's not happy because the mapping isn't the same. XML is not currently supported, so I don't have a parser apparently to do that, but it is returning XML. You can specify in the web API, if you're creating a web API, you can specify what your default return format is as well. Did that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
What is when you write an ID product that not exists?
Right. So okay. So what's the behavior? So that'll be a function of the API. So for example, if I come over here and I say products API and we have a 1 in there, right? And now I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and it returns a 404 not found status, right? And it returns an empty body.
Mm-hmm.
So if we go to my API code, which I really don't want to do right yet, but here we go, get products. And actually that was a single one. So it'll return not found. And that if product is null, return not found. And that's that 404, otherwise return a 200. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but you can basically control what you want to have returned, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool, excellent. Any other questions on that before we get into the puts and posts?
Yeah, just a quick question from me. Would you get
Uh-huh.
a 404? Would you get a 404 error back if you had misspelt one of the parameters going in?
Right. So you can, it totally depends on how the implementer of the API does it. So in my web API code, so here, let me see. So where's my get? There we go. So I could check. So I do a database lookup to find something with that ID. So if it doesn't find anything, returns a 404. I could return something else and say, if I try to, well, let's do this. If I try to pass in like a string there, sorry, let me go here and let's pass in foo and let's see what happens. So 400 bad request. And notice here's the status message we got back.
Yeah, I was more thinking you passed the right ID in, but actually it's one of the optional parameters. You have a typo in there somewhere. So you don't say whether, you miss an A out of whether or something.
Right. So so in now with, right. So, okay, so let's do this, product APIs. Okay, it'll probably blow up because I don't think I handle that error case. All right, yep, product. Oh, that's a single one. Okay, so let's try this. So I return the error code.
Okay, cool.
So in this case, 404 not found. And that's because I have this little check here that says, and this isn't like production level robust. This is demo, but essentially it says, hey, this is not okay. And here's the deal. Does that make sense?
Just really, if the query string parameter was a typo in there somewhere, I was wondering what happened.
Yeah, when I was using the let's go to API calls. When I started off using the VBA JSON, which is where you do this concatenating thing, one thing I did was I tried to put in a bunch of stuff in here that would mess it up and tried to make sure that I could handle whatever error message it was throwing back at me. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, and that's one of the nice things about using VBA Web is you're not likely to at least you're not likely to have like mess up string concatenation, right? You could still give the wrong value, like we did. Sorry, let me go to products API, like we did here where we had the S in there. But yeah. All right, great. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, let me go back into the UI and let me go ahead and create a new guy. And I think we had Hot Fudge. And thankfully it's gone on sale and it's $5.99. So now we've got Hot Fudge. Well, let's go back over to Postman. And we're going to do, right, this is kind of how you would do it, Explore. Okay, I got these guys. Okay, I got Hot Fudge, ID of 1005. I'm going to take that, paste it up here and do that. And now I want to delete it. And I do that. And now if I go back and do get and get rid of that and no more Hot Fudge. And if I come back over here and I get products, no more Hot Fudge. So how does that work? Well, in the case of delete, again, you should see it. Now, one thing I could have done is to put what if I were doing this, like if this were in a production application, I put all these in helper functions, right? But I wanted to keep everything very explicit in the demo so that you could see the repeating pattern and what the differences are. So notice same code here, except for our method is now HTTP delete. And you'll recall here that delete is how we delete an existing record. So our API method is delete. When we are selecting, our API method was get, now it's delete. So here we have HTTP delete, web format JSON, and we pass in a query string. So this is exactly the same as the get, except we're passing in a delete, but we're passing in a single ID as a query string param. It executes, it comes back. Is it good? Show me the output, and we're done. That's a delete. It's that easy. So let's do a new one. Okay, so now we're creating. So we're passing in the data that we need to add to the new record. So any field that's required, we need to handle that. So how does this work? Well, very quickly in form products, so create product, I get the text product name value and the text unit price value. And I have a check up above to make sure there's not missing null data or empty strings. So, all right, so we go back to the products API. So I pass in the name and the unit price of the new guy. Again, same stuff, web client base URL, web request. Here's the resource. Again, I would have all these O's in a single helper function or in module level variables, whatever your preferred method is. Here we are post. So we had HTTP get for select, HTTP delete for delete. Now we have HTTP post for creating a new guy, web format JSON. Now, here's what's different. I have to add body parameters because the data that I want to add has to be passed in the body. So I'm creating for the first time now a body in my web API call, and I'm passing in the field names, product name and unit price, and I'm passing in the values that I passed in via the query string. Other than that, it's exactly the same. Web response, execute web request, do this, set root as object, and pass it back as the response to the calling function. Any questions on that?
I see that you work only with web request when you don't work with a body collection or anything. That's true?
Yes, so far, yes. I mean, I really with VBA Web, I found that in terms of the relatively simple stuff I'm doing here, that's all I needed. And I preferred keeping it as simple as possible for that. But you're right, there are some different ways of doing things. But yeah, this is the way I've kept it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Now the last one, the update. So this is the one that's probably the most complicated because I'm not just passing in two field values and then letting SQL, in this case, create the new unique ID. But now I have to reference an ID for the existing one that I'm changing, and I have to pass in the product name and the unit price. So everything else, look at this, web client, web base URL, web request, API products API, HTTP put. Again, back to our grid, a put is an update. So we're updating an existing record as a put. Creating a new record is a post, sorry about that. Updating, it's a put. So HTTP put, web format JSON. Now, we have the query string. We need the query string because that gets us the record. And then we have to pass back in the query string, the product name, and the unit price in the body. So notice here, query string, method, resource, method, format, query string, and then the body request. So very similar to when we added when we created the new unit. In this case, we're passing in, but we're passing in the ID as well. So if we go and we look at a postman and we say, okay, we got vanilla ice cream, let's go ahead and do a put. So we're going to pass in 1, and we're going to body, and we're going to say product name, and I can't spell, and then line, and then ID 1. So let's see if this works. Put. Okay, let's go back and just change this to a get. Chocolate ice cream, whatever. Anyway, you can see how that works.
Sorry, George, a quick question.
Yes, sir.
Do you have to update every field to update a single field?
Good question. So can I leave, in other words, if I have 20 fields and I just want to update one field, do I have to put in the other 19 with their values? Using put, yes, you do. I think there's another method that you can use to update just a field. It might be patch, I'm not sure, but great question. But using put, yes, you have to. But I'm sure there's another method that allows you to just update a single value. And thank you. Any other questions? All right, let me take a quick second as my 14-month-old enters my study. Sorry about that. To quickly show you the web API. So I talked about this web API. Now, this is on my local host, right? You asked about the URL. This is a local host development machine in Visual Studio, but I could have put this up in Azure if I wanted to. Now, the question is, and I talked about how it's relatively easy to build this. Let me show you quickly what that looks like in Visual Studio. And let's see, is this the right one? Web API demo. Yes. So how does this work? Basically, it automatically created, let me collapse these real quick. And there's a lot of junk in here and I apologize for it, but if I collapse them, hopefully it kind of makes sense. So this created a get for the API, a get for the API with a query string parameter, a put for the API of 5, that's our update, a post for an API, that's our insert, and a delete, passing in the URL, passing in the ID. How difficult is that to do? What's involved in Visual Studio? Again, this is the one that I'm using, but let me just for grins, I'm just going to create this one from scratch. And I think it'll take about 5 minutes. So I'm going to create a .NET web application. Next, call it, find this, whatever, create. And I'm going to create a web API and click create. And it's going to fire it up. So we're creating it from scratch. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to point it to my database and say, use this SQL database to create the web API. And there's the new project. So I go right click, add, there's 2 steps. I added ADO.NET data entity model from the database. Next, I'm going to create a new connection to my local database here. The server is a period, and I'm going to call it web, oops, period, sorry. And then web API demo, that's my database. That's my connection, looks good. And now what this will do is this will essentially create an EDMX or an entity diagram of my one table that I have inherited this. So I'll just do that, click finish. So it'll take a minute or so while it grinds away. It goes off, it talks to the database, it queries the database for the database schema, and it comes back and it creates a class, a C# class that maps fields in that database to properties on a C# object, which is going to be called product. It's also going to create a database connection, which will allow me to connect to the database. And then finally, it creates a visual of what that looks like. Okay, so there's the visual. You can see there's product ID, product name, unit price. That maps to a C# object that has been created called product.cs. And what's going to happen is that the web API is going to use that I'm building right now. The web API is going to use that to do the updates and so forth. So now, I did, right? I created a web API. I created an entity framework model pointing to an existing database. Visual Studio went off. Entity Framework actually went off and reverse engineered that database. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my web API. I come over here and I say, add new scaffolded item. And I'm going to click Web API with actions using Entity Framework. I'm going to go add. I'm going to pick my model class, which is product, and my database connection string, which is that, and products controller, that's fine. Add. So now what's happening is that it's installing any packages that are needed. And, okay, Tom has a great question. And then it goes off and does essentially scaffolding out. So there's exactly what you had that I'm calling in my existing one. Notice that it just created this and say, okay, get products, db.products. Now this uses Entity Framework, which is an object property approach to querying a database. And Tom had a great question, and Juan Jose had a great question that I'm going to come back to in just a second. But notice that in this case, it's using Entity Framework, and it just says find my ID. Here's my put. Okay. Modify it, save the changes, yada, yada, yada. This is all Entity Framework code that basically replaces SQL. But right now, if I hit Control F5, which is going to run this in my browser, notice that this one was on 4430 as the port. And this one is on, okay, so I need to go to help. Is that what it is? All right, let me system here. Will be surprised that didn't load. All right, interesting. Murphy's Law, right? I've never had one of these fail, but for some reason, this guy isn't loading, and I'm not sure why. But anyway, trust me, that's how long it took me to build the one that I used for this. I don't know why this one isn't loading. Now, 2 questions. First of all, what if I don't want to use Entity Framework? Right? What if I want to have actually SQL? What if I want to say return select star from product, right? Or select, price, what was it? Right, so I can do this, right? There are ways in the API framework, in the web API model, essentially in .NET, of basically using SQL to return your values. I'm not going to show it here, but you can do it. Second question from Tom, what about stored procedures? So stored procedures, again, you can do the same thing. You can reference a stored procedure via Entity Framework, and it will return the values back to you. So just like we had the SQL there, you would say something like, SP underscore blah, blah, execute, or something to that effect. You can also use a third-party add-in called Dapper, which is what Stack Overflow uses, which is a super high-speed way of getting data, either using inline SQL or stored procedures. And I will add that to my, let me see, I will add that to my, trying to click this and see if this has it. I think he uses Dapper in this one. Yeah, I think he uses Dapper in this. So I will put a link to using stored procedures and SQL in web APIs, so that if you're interested in building one using Visual Studio, you can do so without having to use Entity Framework. Okay, great. Any other questions?
George, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So the base URL is localhost. When I deploy my Access application to a bunch of users,
Right.
because it's local, so they probably won't have access to that URL, right?
Yeah, so you would publish this to a web server somewhere. So let's say this is on Azure. I would just call this myapi.azurewebsites.net. Okay, so this would be my website. Or let's say the dog. Let's say we got in the web API business and we're going to return the next 3 presentations as a JSON object. So then I would say, and then I would here I'd say API, or presentations. Okay, so you would put whatever the actual URL is. In our city weather, notice that the base URL was api.openmeteo.com/v1. So that was our base URL, and then we added forecast as a route to that. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
How do you control the API text that you write before the code? I say in Spanish.
Yes, go ahead.
¿Cómo controlas que se pone API después de la base URL o que se pone otra cosa distinta para poder responder?
Okay, so the question is, how do you control the routing of your APIs? And so in this case, in the model, where is that set up?
It's in controller.
Yeah, so here's the controller, but the routing, so you can put the route here in line, and I can't remember, is it route, R-O-U-T? Yeah, route. So
yes.
you can use that, and you can set it as a parameter there, but you can also use, where is that? Route config. So you can also set it up in here as a route. And by default, when you create the API using, in this case, using Visual Studio and .NET Framework, it automatically puts that API in there. But you can get rid of it. You can put anything you want there.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Let's see. Okay, so stored procedures. Okay, so we are at about 3 minutes left, and appreciate your patience with this. It's been a little long. I will make this code available, and I need to update the slide deck with a few URLs, and I will have that up on the dog site tomorrow. So if you're interested in getting the downloads, just go to dog.org. Okay, go to dog.org, presentations, and then here, this will probably move down, but you'll see a download link here for download materials. And I'll go ahead and have the slide deck and the Access application up there as a demo for you if you're interested. So thank you. Yes, one last question. Go ahead.
So the last question is, can I apply this method to SharePoint?
So can SharePoint be an API backend, or can you use? Yeah, I have no idea. I would do some searching around and see if you can find any information on if SharePoint exposes a web API. I know they expose something, but I don't know what that is. So,
Great. Thank you.
okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, I will have the download up for you probably midday tomorrow. And thanks again. And we'll see you next month at the Denver Area Access User Group. Thank you for joining us.
Again, everyone, and thank you, George. It was a great presentation.